Hey you guys, good morning. Today is Wednesday, March 25th. This is day 8 of us being at home. I just want to give you a quick heads up that some things by next week might look a little bit different. I know I have some calendars out for all of you to be doing some work in both math, reading, writing, and social studies every day. We'll definitely be finishing out our social studies calendar and probably our other two calendars also, but I'm also looking to make a Google Classroom. So I'll be teaching you a little bit more about that probably on Monday or maybe at the end of this week to teach you how to log into that and to view my Google Classroom. So some of the resources that you're looking for, you're not having to click all over the place to go to all these different links. Hopefully everything could just be put in the Google Classroom for you. So stay tuned for a little bit more information on that. Today we are continuing in the southeast region. Today is a video from Florida. It's not actually from Orlando, Florida. It's from my dad in East Lansing with some Mickey gear on. But my grandparents live in Florida part of the year. They didn't feel confident recording a video, so they emailed some of their responses. And then my dad used their responses to record a video from East Lansing. So as you know, my family loves Disney World. We were supposed to be leaving to go to Disney World in a couple weeks over spring break. So we've been really staying tuned on what's happening in Florida also to see how Orlando is doing. As you know, Disney World is closed. So we won't be going there this spring break, which is a huge bummer for my dad. So you'll hear him talk about Disney, but also what Disney is doing to kind of help people during this time, which is really cool. So today, make sure you get on, do a little bit of math, a little bit of reading. The comment that you'll make today is actually going to be close to 3 sentences. I'll explain to you when we're done with our reading today, but we're moving on to the third finger of our 5-finger retell. So we've already done who were the characters. Then we did where and when was this part of the story taking place. Today we're going to practice telling what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. Normally, you would use that part of the retell if you were retelling like a whole book or if you were retelling a whole chapter. We're going to practice it today with just the section that I'm reading. So you'll tell me what happened in the beginning of the part I read, the middle of the part that I read, and the end of the part that I read. Usually you write those using words like first, blah, 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 next, blah, 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 finally, blah, 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 blah. Or you could say first, this happened, then this happened, and at the end, this happened. So you could use those words beginning and middle and end if you wanted to. You could start your first sentence by saying in the beginning. Your second sentence could say in the middle of this part of the book. Your last sentence could say at the end. Totally up to you how you start that, but using some kind of sentence starter so I know which sentence is telling me the beginning, middle, and the end. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading today. Make sure you check out the video from Orlando, Florida today and explore some other states on National Geographic Kids in the Northeast region. Keep staying tuned for Mr. Secor's morning announcements. I'll do a little bit of reading, take some time to do some math, reading on your own today, and respond to the writing prompt if you're able. Those have been fun to be reading. So yesterday, we ended with a car crash, and this was after we already knew Uncle Monty had passed away and Count Olaf, or other known as Stefano, was trying to take the kids to still get on the Prospero to head to Peru. It sounds like maybe crime in Peru he would have been able to get away with a little bit better. But he happened to crash into Mr. Poe, and that's where we leave off now. Mr. Poe doesn't quite know that it's Stefano, but we're hopeful that he'll figure it out. This again was the picture that's going to start today's reading. Looks like that's the picture of Uncle Monty in his study. What do you mean was? Mr. Poe asked sternly. Were you fired? Oh, remember, so Stefano had just told him that he worked for Dr. Montgomery. No, Dr. Montgomery, excuse me. Stefano turned away and pretended to dab at his eyes as if he were too sad to continue. Facing away from Mr. Poe, he gave the orphans a big wink before continuing. I'm sorry to tell you there's been a horrible accident, Mr. Doe. Dr. Montgomery is dead. Poe, Mr. Poe said. He's dead? That's terrible. What has happened? I don't know, Stefano said. It looks like snake bite to me, but I don't know anything about snakes. That's why I was going into town to get a doctor. The children seemed too upset to be left alone. He's not taking us to get a doctor, Klaus shouted. He's taking us to Peru. You see what I mean, Stefano said to Mr. Poe, patting Klaus's head. The children are obviously very distressed. Dr. Montgomery was going to take them to Peru today. Yes, I know, Mr. Poe said. That's why I hurried over here this morning to finally bring them their luggage. Klaus, I know you're confused and upset over this accident, but please try to understand that if Dr. Montgomery is really dead, the expedition is canceled. But Mr. Poe, Klaus said indignantly. Please, Mr. Poe said. This is a matter for adults to discuss. Klaus, clearly a doctor needs to be called. Well, why don't you drive up on the house, Stefano said, and I'll take the children to find a doctor. Jose, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, no way. Kind of like the phrase, no way, Jose. Why don't we all go to the house, Mr. Poe said, and call for a doctor? Stefano blinked, and for a second his face grew angry again, before he was able to calm himself and answer smoothly. Of course, he said, I should have called earlier. Obviously, I'm not thinking as clearly as you. Here, children, get back in the Jeep and Mr. Poe will follow us. We're not getting back in the car with you, Klaus said firmly. Please, Klaus, Mr. Poe said, try to understand. There's been a serious accident. All other discussions will have to be put aside. The only trouble is I'm not sure my car will start. It's very smashed up. Try the ignition, Stefano said. Mr. Poe nodded and walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine made a rough, wet noise. It sounded quite a bit like Mr. Poe's cough. But it did not start. I'm afraid the engine is quite dead, Mr. Poe called out, and before long, Stefano muttered to the children, You will be too. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. I couldn't hear you. Stefano smiled. I said, That's too bad. Well, why don't I take the orphans back to the house and you walk behind us? There isn't room for everyone. Mr. Poe frowned. But the children's suitcases are here. I don't want to leave them unattended. Why don't we put the luggage into your car and the children and I will walk back to the house? Stefano frowned. Well, one of the children should ride with me so I won't get lost. Mr. Poe smiled. But you can see the house from here. You won't get lost. Stefano doesn't want us to be alone with you, Violet said, finally speaking up. She had been waiting for the proper moment to make her case. He's afraid that we'll tell you who he really is and what he's really up to. What's she talking about? Mr. Poe asked Stefano. I have no idea, Mr. Toe, Stefano replied, shaking his head and looking at Violet fiercely. Violet took a deep breath. This man is not Stefano, she said, pointing at him. He's Count Olaf, and he's here to take us away. Who am I? Stefano asked. What am I doing? Mr. Poe looked Stefano up and down and then shook his head. Forgive the children, he said. They are very upset. Count Olaf is a terrible man who tried to steal their money, and the youngsters are very frightened of him. Do I look like this, Count Olaf? Stefano asked, his eyes shining. No, you do not, Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf had one long eyebrow and a clean-shaven face. You have a beard, and if you don't mind me saying, no eyebrows at all. He shaved his eyebrow, Violet said, and grew a beard. Everyone can see that, and he has the tattoo, Klaus cried. The eye tattoo on his ankle. Look at the tattoo. Mr. Poe looked at Stefano and shrugged apologetically. I'm sorry to ask you this, he said. But the children seemed so upset, and before we discuss anything further, I'd like to put their minds at ease. Would you mind showing me your ankle? I'd be happy to, Stefano said, giving the children a toothy smile. Right or left? Klaus closed his eyes and thought for a second. Left, he said. Stefano placed his left foot on the bumper of Uncle Monty's Jeep. Looking at the Baudelaire orphans with his shiny eyes, he began to raise the leg of his stained, striped pants. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, and Mr. Poe all kept their eyes on Stefano's ankle. The pant leg went up, like a curtain, rising to begin a play. But there was no tattoo of an eye to be seen. The Baudelaire orphans stared at a patch of smooth skin, as blank and pale as poor Uncle Monty's face. That was the end of chapter 7. This is the picture to start chapter 8 tomorrow. If you wanted to think back on this whole chapter, you could when you're doing your 3 sentences today. So you could start by saying at the beginning of the chapter, they found Uncle Monty dead. In the middle, you could say they got into a car crash with Mr. Poe when Stefano was trying to take them to the boat, or to the Prospero. And then you could end by saying, and finally, Stefano proved to Mr. Poe that he wasn't actually Count Olaf, or tried to prove to Mr. Poe that he wasn't Count Olaf. You could say something like that, or you could focus on just what we read today. In the beginning of what we read today, the kids and Stefano had just gotten in an accident with Mr. Poe. In the middle, they got out to try to convince Mr. Poe that Stefano was Count Olaf, and in the end, you could say that Mr. Poe believed Stefano and didn't believe the children. Kind of up to you how you write that, but think about what stands out to you from the beginning, the middle, and the end, and try to write 3 sentences if you can. I know that that's a long one today. We'll kind of start getting a little bit shorter as we go, but today try to tell me what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end of your story. I'll set up another way that you could respond if you wanted to in the comments below. Instead of doing full sentences, you could just respond to my questions. Or the way that I've formatted it. So you decide what's best for you, and I'll take a look at those for tomorrow. So thanks guys for listening. I hope that you have a great Wednesday, that you're staying healthy, you're washing your hands, and you're being kind to your families. Don't forget that you are so loved and you are so missed, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.